Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read The Black Cat. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence, yet mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events were terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than Baroque's. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I would have noticed, for the docile humanity of my disposition, my tenderness of heart was even conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time and never was so unhappy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for the faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly to be at the trouble of explaining the nature of the intensity of the gratification of thus derivable. This is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity for procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. Then later, the remarkable large and beautiful animal, and entirely black and sagacious to be an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention that matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate, and alone I fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. I was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had I experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, and more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her perennial violence. My pet, of course, was made to feel the change of my disposition, and not only neglected but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain him from my maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog. But by accident or through affection, they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, and what disease is like alcohol, and at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and sequentially somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him when, in his fright at my violence, my inflicted a wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-natured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately backed into my spirit and half sentiment that second, but was not remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, but to look about me among the vile haunts I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance to which to supply its balance. One night, as I sat half stupefied in the den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing the head of the immense hedgehogs to of gin or of rum that constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of the hedgehog for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had no sooner perceived the object, whereupon I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, full at large as Pluto and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white covering the nearly whole region of his breast. Upon my touching him, immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbing against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This then was the very creature of which I was in search. At once I offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, and never had seen it before, and continued my caresses, and then I prepared to go home. The animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patted it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great favorite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike as it arising with me. This was just the reverse of what I anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evidence fondness of myself rather than disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not for weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it had also been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, was endeared it to my wife, who I have already said possessed in a high degree the humanity of feeling, which had once been my distinguished trait and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, it partially for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity that it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. However, I sat as I would couch beneath my chair, upspring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. As I rose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fasten it along the sharp claws in my dress chamber as the manner to my breast. And at such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by the memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, but absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and that I should be at a loss how otherwise to defend it. I am almost ashamed to own it. Yes, even in the felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and the horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merriest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite by a slow degrees which imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, and had at length assumed a rigorous distinction of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared, as was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows, O mournful and terrible engine of horror and crime and agony and of death. And now I was indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, as a brute beast whose fellow I had contemplatively destroyed, the brute beast to work out for me, a man fashioned to the image of a high God, as much of an insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night, nor I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started hourly by dreams of inutterable fear, and find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight and inaccurate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torment such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, and the darkest and most evil of thoughts, the moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon my household errand to the cellar of an old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which I had hitherto stayed my mind, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished, but this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with an entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house either by day or by night without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. As one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well of the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon me that I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar. As the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed and had very lately been plastered without the rough plaster which the dampness in the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was the projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could steadily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the hole up before that no eye could detect anything suspicious. In this calculation, I was not deceived. The means of the crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks and carefully deposited the body against the inner wall. I propped it in that position. While the little trouble, I relayed the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured the mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could be distinguished from the old, and from all this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. Then, when I finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at last, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look at the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, and I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. I had been able to meet with it at the moment there could have been no doubt at its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger and forbore to present itself to my present mood. It is impossible to describe or imagine the deep, blissful sense of relief that the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. I did not take its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day passed till my tormentor came not. Again, once again, I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. My guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search of my instituted, of course, nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon the future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came over unexpectedly into the house. proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the incredibility of the place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They looked no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as if that of who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee of my heart was too strong to be restrained. I turned to say, if but one word, by way of triumph and to render doubly sure the assurance of my guiltlessness. Gentlemen, I said at last, as the party attended the steps, I delight to have allied your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. But by the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon the very portion of the brickwork behind that stood the corpse of my wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice within the tomb, by a cry I first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned, in their agony of the demons that exult into the damnation. Of my own thoughts, it is folly to speak. Swooning, and I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant, the party on the stairs remained motionless through extremity of terror and of awe. The next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It felt bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clouded with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder and whose informing voice had consigned me into the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. That's the end of The Black Cat. We'll leave other poems and other authors from England and America, the story of England and America, to the Knights of the Round Table, to the Magna Carta, to your Constitution of the United States. God bless the Constitution and the people of America. Have a nice day.